You can tell when a piece of ground has given up on being soil and started acting more like packing material. Water lands on it and just sits there, or runs off. A trowel hits the surface and makes that dry, hollow scrape. Seedlings go in green and hopeful, then stall like they have changed their minds about life. People look at a patch like that and usually come to one of two conclusions. Either they think they need to buy a cart full of products, or they think the spot is just cursed. Most of the time, it is neither. Most of the time, weak soil is not dead because it lacks some miracle powder. It is weak because the life that was supposed to be fed there has been starved, exposed, chopped up, baked out, or washed away. And the clever trick that starts bringing it back is almost insultingly simple. You stop leaving the soil naked, and you start feeding it from the top. That is it. Not in a lazy, vague, throw anything anywhere kind of way. In a steady, deliberate, old practical way that turns poor ground dark, crumbly, and workable again. Over time, people hear that and sometimes feel disappointed, because modern gardening has trained folks to expect rescue in a bottle or a bag with a bright label and a list of promises. Fast green up, bigger blooms, maximum yield, instant correction. But soil does not really think that way. Soil responds more like a living household than a machine. If you strip the roof off, throw out the pantry, and keep kicking the walls in, no single delivery is going to make the place healthy. You rebuild it by restoring the pattern that keeps it alive. And that pattern begins with cover and food. There was a time when more people understood this without needing a lecture about it. They may not have used fancy words for soil biology. They may not have talked about fungal networks over supper. But they knew a few things in their bones. Ground under leaves stayed softer. Garden rows mulched with old hay held moisture longer. Places where kitchen scraps, weeds, and bedding broke down turned richer than places kept scraped bare and proud-looking. Somewhere along the way, a lot of people traded that kind of noticing for a shinier habit. Clean, exposed dirt started looking correct. Bare beds looked tidy. A hard-raked surface looked finished. And then, when the ground baked, crusted, compacted, and lost its smell, the answer became buying fertility instead of rebuilding it. That is the part worth reclaiming. Because once you understand what weak soil is usually missing, you stop throwing random fixes at symptoms and start restoring the system that makes soil act alive again. So let us talk plain. What does weak soil usually look like? It can look pale and dusty. It can look gray and tired. It can form a crust after rain and crack after heat. It can drain too fast because there is no sponge in it, or stay soggy because there is no structure. It can grow weeds that seem tougher than any crop you plant on purpose. It can grow plants that look hungry, even when you swear you fed them. Sometimes the ground is technically full of minerals on paper and still behaves like poor soil in real life, because the structure and biology are a mess. That last part matters. Weak soil is not always empty soil. Sometimes it is locked up soil. Sometimes it is lifeless soil. Sometimes it is soil that has been handled in all the wrong ways for so long that it no longer knows how to breathe, hold water, or support roots comfortably. And this is why the clever trick works better than people expect. Covering the ground and feeding it from the top does several jobs at once. It shields the surface from sun and pounding rain. It slows moisture loss. It feeds worms and microbes. It softens temperature swings. It reduces crusting. It builds humus gradually. It encourages roots to move through friendlier ground. And it does all of that without you having to rip the whole place apart every season. The trick is simple. The effect is layered. That is usually how real garden wisdom works. Now, when I say feed from the top, I am talking about adding organic matter to the surface in a way the soil life can process. Compost, shredded leaves, aged manure if you trust the source. Grass clippings used carefully. Straw, old plant trimmings that are not diseased. Even chopped cover crops. Think blanket and pantry at the same time. A lot of people want to dig every bit of this in immediately, because they think if some is good, forcing it down faster must be better. But the old sense in this method is that the top of the soil is where nature does much of the handoff. Forests do not rot their leaves 6 inches down with a tiller. Grasslands are fed from above and below through roots, litter, grazing, decay, and time. The surface is not a problem to bypass. It is the front porch. That is where the meal arrives. And once you start thinking this way, the garden begins to look different. Fallen leaves stop looking like trash, and start looking like future tilth. Weeds you pull stop feeling like pure nuisance if they can be dried and returned safely. Kitchen scraps become something you plan around instead of something you hide at the curb. You stop asking, "What can I buy to wake this soil up?" and start asking, "What can I return to it consistently enough that life comes back?" Let me make this practical. If you have a tired bed right now, one that seems to grow disappointment better than vegetables, the first move is not to attack it harder. The first move is to stop exposing it. Pull or cut the big weeds. Water if the ground is bone dry. Then lay down a generous top layer of compost if you have it. Even half an inch helps. An inch is better. More can be fine if it is finished compost and you are not smothering existing crops. Then cover that with mulch. Shredded leaves are excellent. Straw works. Old hay can work if you can live with the seeds. The point is to create a feeding blanket that keeps the compost where the life is active and keeps the surface from being punished. If you do not have much compost, do not use that as an excuse to do nothing. A thin layer repeated over time beats one heroic purchase followed by neglect. Weak soil often comes back through steadiness, not drama. That is another correction worth holding on to. People love the idea of a single grand fix. Soil usually prefers regular meals. And yes, there are times when the ground may need something else too. Maybe lime, depending on a test. Maybe drainage changes. Maybe less foot traffic. Maybe more root growth from cover crops. But even then, keeping the soil covered and fed from the top is still one of the foundational moves, because it supports nearly every other improvement you are trying to make. Now, if the bed is empty and you are not in a rush to plant it, this trick gets even stronger when paired with roots. Scatter a cover crop suited to your season, let it grow, then cut it down and leave it right there, or lay mulch over it. That gives you above-ground organic matter and below-ground root channels at the same time. Roots are not just anchors, they are workers. They pry, leak sugars, host microbes, create pathways, and leave behind structure when they die. A weak bed with living roots in it is usually on a better road than a bare bed with expensive amendments and no life. This is where many gardeners start seeing the bigger principle. The clever trick is not just mulch. It is protecting and feeding the community that turns dirt into soil. That is why some patches seem to improve almost mysteriously once you quit scraping them clean. Worms return. Moisture lingers longer. The shovel enters easier. Seedlings stop sulking quite so much. The color deepens. The smell changes too. And that is something old gardeners trusted more than modern people often do. Good soil has a smell. Not perfume. Not rot. A rich, earthy, living smell. When a bed starts smelling like that again, you know you are moving in the right direction, even before the harvest proves it. Of course, this is where impatience tries to get involved. Somebody hears that soil can come back and imagines one weekend of mulching will turn hardpan into black garden heaven by Tuesday. Usually not. Some ground responds fast. Sandy, starved beds can show noticeable change in one season if you feed them well and keep them covered. Heavier clay may take longer to loosen and regulate. Ground that has been compacted for years will not forget everything in a month. But this is exactly why the trick matters so much. It works with time instead of pretending to defeat it. You are not painting the soil. You are reintroducing a way of living. And that matters because so much garden frustration comes from treating symptoms instead of causes. Yellow leaves? Feed the plant. Wilting? Water more. Poor growth? Add stronger fertilizer. Crusty bed? Rake it smoother. Then the cycle repeats, because the soil beneath the symptoms never really got healthier. It just got pushed along. The top feeding, always covered method breaks that pattern. It asks a different question. Not how do I force a result out of this bed today, but how do I make this bed more capable next month, next season, next year? That is not flashy, but it is powerful. And if you have ever inherited tired ground, you know why that matters. A lot of people garden in places that have been neglected, scraped by builders, compacted by feet, mined by repeated crops, or simply left exposed season after season. They are not starting with the kind of soil that falls apart in dark crumbs on a magazine cover. They are starting with what they have: thin topsoil, clay that sets like brick, sand that loses water like a sieve, beds that never seem to keep momentum. Those are exactly the places where this old trick earns its keep, because it does not require perfect starting conditions. It creates better ones. There is also a rhythm to doing this through the year. And once you learn that rhythm, the method becomes almost automatic. In late fall, when leaves are coming down and the garden is winding towards sleep, that is one of the finest times to begin. Instead of hauling every leaf away like it is a nuisance, shred what you can and let the garden benefit. Spread compost first if you have it, then leaves, then a lighter layer of straw if the wind in your place likes to rearrange things before winter settles in. In spring, the temptation is to rake everything off so the bed looks neat and ready. Resist that urge unless the layer is so heavy it is keeping the ground cold far too long. Usually you can pull mulch aside where you plant, tuck transplants in, or open a small furrow for seed while leaving most of the surface protected. That one decision alone can save a lot of moisture later, especially once hot weather arrives and everyone around you starts complaining that they cannot keep up with watering. In summer, the same trick becomes your shield against punishment. Sun is valuable on leaves. It is often brutal on bare soil. A bed covered through summer stays more even. After a thunderstorm, it does not crust the same way. After a dry spell, it does not lose itself so fast. This is when people start noticing that the covered beds feel cooler at the surface and friendlier underneath. Put your hand under the mulch on a hot day and compare it to exposed ground. Then, in late summer or early fall, when one crop comes out, do not leave the bed stripped while you decide what happens next. That empty stretch between crops is one of the quiet ways soil gets weaker. If you are not replanting right away, give it something, a layer of compost and mulch. This matters in different soil types too. Sandy ground usually needs help holding on. Top feeding and cover give it sponge and steadiness. Clay ground usually needs help opening up and calming down. Top feeding and cover soften the blows of rain, reduce baking, and encourage life that loosens what your shovel used to fight. In both cases, the method is similar, even though the problems look different. That is part of why it is such a reliable old approach. It is not a narrow fix for one exact condition. It is a broad repair for the broken relationship between surface, moisture, air, and organic matter. And if you garden in a place with wind, this trick matters twice. Wind does not just dry plants, it strips the ground. A bare bed under wind can lose moisture almost as fast as a thirsty crop can take it up. So if you have ever felt like your soil turns back to powder no matter how often you water, the problem may not just be what you are pouring on, it may be what you are failing to protect. Some people ask whether this works in small raised beds too, and the answer is yes, often beautifully. In fact, raised beds that are constantly harvested can become hungry faster than people realize because they look orderly and productive on the surface, while organic matter is quietly being spent underneath. Top dress them, mulch them, keep roots in them, as much of the year as you reasonably can. There is also a practical difference between feeding soil and burying trash. The method is not an excuse to toss thick raw scraps right where you plan to seed delicate crops tomorrow and hope for elegance. Coarse materials need time. Strong manures need judgment. Big stalks break down slower than leaves. The trick works best when you match the material to the moment. Fine compost near planting. Coarser mulch around established crops. Bigger rough stuff on resting beds, where time can do the chewing. There is also a money lesson in this, and it is not a small one. People with weak soil are often the easiest targets for expensive promises. The more discouraged you feel, the more tempting the shiny rescue becomes. One bag for this, one liquid for that, one booster for roots, one tonic for transplant shock, one magic blend for yields. Before long, a small backyard plot is costing more than a hobby should, and the ground still seems hungry. Now, I am not saying every purchased product is useless. Some are helpful. Some are necessary in specific cases. But if the soil remains exposed, organic matter remains low, and the life in the bed remains underfed, you are trying to decorate weakness instead of repair it. That is why this method feels so good once you commit to it. It moves the work back into common sense. Save leaves. Make compost. Use mulch. Grow roots. Return residues. Disturb less when you can. Stop idolizing bare dirt. It is not a glamorous program, but it builds something real. And because it builds something real, the benefits start stacking up in ways people notice quickly. You water less often. The surface stays looser. Weeds pull easier. Rain soaks in better. Plants hold on through heat with less drama. The bed stops swinging so wildly between mud and dust. These are not small comforts. They are the daily proof that the ground is recovering function, not just appearance. Now let us talk about a few common mistakes, because people can hear a good principle and still apply it in a way that slows everything down. First, do not smother the soil with material that mats and seals if used too thick all at once. Fresh grass clippings are useful, but if you dump them in a heavy wet slab, you can create a sour layer that sheds water and smells wrong. Thin layers are safer. Let them dry between applications or mix them with drier materials. Second, be thoughtful about what you bring in. Straw is fine if it is reasonably clean. Manure is valuable if aged and from a source you trust. Leaves are wonderful unless contaminated. Weak soil needs feeding, yes, but it also needs sane feeding. Third, do not till every beautiful layer in, just because you get nervous seeing mulch on top. That surface layer is working. The worms know where it is. The fungi know where it is. Constantly burying everything can break the rhythm you are trying to establish, especially in already weak ground. Fourth, do not expect mulch alone to solve deep compaction if you keep walking on the same bed, driving wheelbarrows over it when wet, or letting the ground stay rootless for long stretches. The trick works best as part of a broader habit of respecting soil structure. That may be the most practical phrase in this whole conversation. Respect soil structure. People respect harvests. They respect ripe tomatoes, full baskets, clean carrots, and thick squash vines. But the structure beneath it all often gets treated like an afterthought. Then when the plants struggle, the mystery begins. It is not much of a mystery. Roots need air, moisture balance, pathways, and companionship. Weak soil usually offers too little of one, too much of another, and almost no stability. Covering and top feeding starts restoring that stability. Now, in truly terrible ground, you may need to help the process along with broad forking, careful loosening, or raised beds, especially if construction left the place compacted like a parking lot. But even then, once you create that first opening, the blanket and feed approach is what keeps improvement going. Mechanical loosening without organic rebuilding is just a temporary interruption. The soil settles back into trouble if nothing changes in the life above and within it. This is one reason experienced growers often seem less obsessed with dramatic interventions than beginners expect. They know the soil remembers habits. Good ones too. Give it a better habit, and it begins answering differently. This is also where the old method ties directly into self-reliance. If you learn to read weak soil correctly, you become harder to sell nonsense to. You do not panic every time a bed looks tired. You stop assuming every problem requires a purchase. You understand that fertility is not just a substance, it is a cycle. Matter returning, life processing, moisture held, roots moving, shade on the ground, air in the profile. That understanding changes how you spend money, how you use waste, and how patient you are with rebuilding something that matters. And once you get that, you start seeing opportunities everywhere. Autumn leaves become future garden structure. Spent bean vines become cover. Pulled weeds, if not seeding or diseased, become feed once dried. Chicken bedding, properly aged, becomes a gift. A cover crop becomes both protection and amendment. Even cardboard, used wisely under mulch in some situations, can help you start reclaiming a rough patch while the life above and below goes to work. You stop looking at the yard like a collection of chores and start seeing a flow of materials. That is old knowledge in a very practical form. Nothing is wasted if it can safely re-enter the cycle, and that cycle is what weak soil has usually lost. Let me give you a picture of how this often plays out in real seasons. The first year, the change may feel modest. The bed stays damp longer. The crusting eases. A few crops do better than expected. Worms show up where you had almost forgotten them. The second year, it gets more noticeable. Digging is easier. Seedlings root faster. The surface underneath the mulch starts looking darker and friendlier. By the third year, people often say some version of the same thing. It does not feel like the same ground anymore. That sentence is gold. Not because it sounds poetic, because it means the system has begun to turn. And once the system turns, you do not have to fight so hard for every result. That is the real payoff. Not just better plants, but less strain, less emergency, less chasing. A garden that starts helping you back. There is one more part people miss, and it may be the most human part of the whole subject. Weak soil can make a person doubt themselves. You plant carefully, water faithfully, even spend money trying to help, and still the bed underperforms. After enough of that, people start thinking they are bad gardeners. when sometimes what they really have is a damaged foundation. When the foundation improves, their confidence improves too, because finally their effort has somewhere to go. So if you have a patch that keeps disappointing you, I would not begin with blame. I would begin with the surface. Is it covered? Is it being fed? Are there living roots there often enough? Are you disturbing more than necessary? Are you asking the soil to give without returning much? Those questions are far more useful than asking which miracle product you forgot to buy. And yes, there are situations where you may still need a soil test, especially if something is seriously off. That is sensible. But even then, the everyday work of covering and top feeding remains one of the most reliable ways to build the kind of ground that holds improvements instead of wasting them. So here is the reclaimed rule in plain language. Do not leave your soil naked. Do not starve it between crops. Do not scrape away what could have fed it. Build from the top. Keep something living there when you can. Let time and life do the kind of work money alone cannot do. That is the clever trick. Not because it is flashy, because it solves more than one problem at once. It turns weak soil into recovering soil into workable soil into productive soil, and productive soil into the kind of garden ground people trust. That trust matters. When you trust your soil more, you garden differently. You plant with more confidence. You waste less water. You lose fewer seedlings. You make calmer decisions. You stop feeling like each season is a fresh emergency. The bed begins acting like a partner instead of a test. And maybe that is what people before us understood so well. Soil is not a stage you perform gardening on. It is the living middle of the whole thing. If you keep that middle fed, covered, and inhabited, a lot of smaller troubles become easier to bear, and many larger ones never arrive with the same force. So if I were standing in your yard, looking at the weakest patch you have, the advice would not be complicated. I would not tell you to scrape it clean and start shopping. I would tell you to cover it, feed it, root it, and give it a little time to remember what soil is supposed to do. And I would be curious which material has made the biggest difference where you garden. Compost, leaves, straw, cover crops, old hay, wood chips on paths, or simply quitting the habit of leaving dirt bare. Because sometimes the best thing a gardener can pass along